I support Bill C-5, but it doesn't go far enough.
I don't know how many of you committee members have taken the opportunity to look at all of the Green amendments. There's 44 of them. Trafficking a person under 18, obtaining sexual services for consideration from a person under 18, procuring a person under 18. Is there a common theme? Almost all of them deal with children.
Mr. Moria, I would ask that you stick to...
I agree 100%. If I was Mr. Morrison, I wouldn't want to speak to all those things either. But, you know, they dumped it into our committee, eliminating mandatory penalties for serious offenses against children. And now they get here and they don't want to speak to it.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
I support Bill C-5, but it doesn't go far enough. As we've looked at the Supreme Court decisions, we've looked at many Court of Appeal decisions all across the country. We know a number of things. And I'll go back to when C-10, the omnibus crime bill under Stephen Harper, went through Parliament. I was a member of Parliament. I fought very hard against it because there was absolutely no evidence that mandatory minimums worked to reduce crime rates. There was evidence to the contrary. The state of Texas was already removing its mandatory minimums while our Parliament was charging ahead to bring them in. So I support removing mandatory minimums. All of my amendments and a few others that are to a slightly different point seek to do more to remove mandatory minimums. They are expensive, inefficient. They pass the costs of incarceration onto provinces. There are many, many arguments as to why they don't make any sense. And, of course, the arguments we've heard a few times mentioned today, that we see disproportionate incarceration of people of color, of Indigenous peoples, at rates that are well known, so I won't repeat that evidence here. Just to say that my First Amendment, I can deal with it, but I want to also raise a larger point, Mr. Chair, which is that if I could, seeing the painful filibuster that we've seen the last 2.5 hours, if I could, I'd say, well, let's just take all my amendments that are inadmissible. Excuse me.
We just have a point of order, Ms. May.
Oh, sorry.
In reference to my friend's comments about a painful filibuster, I wholeheartedly disagree, and I find that quite offensive. We have an obligation to provide some commentary with respect to the amendments. A filibuster, again, from a rookie politician's point of view, is if I decided to open up my criminal code on page 1 and started reading all 1,400 pages. That's a filibuster. I didn't hear any points of order from anyone on this committee regarding relevancy. And in my view, my points and my colleagues' points were all relevant with respect to the points that we were making. So I wanted to bring that to your attention because I find that language rather offensive.
Brock, Ms. May, you can continue, I think.
Well, I'd just like to apologize from the bottom of my heart to Mr. Brock. It was you're quite right. That didn't meet the definition of a filibuster, but it is a definite effort to slow down the review of this legislation. I had thought that since my First Amendment came up under Clause 6, that it would be attended to relatively early in a 2-hour committee hearing. So, and I'm not inexperienced, and you're quite right, Mr. Brock. It doesn't meet the definition of a filibuster, but it does place me, since I've brought forward most of the amendments before the committee tonight, in something of a quandary. I don't have the right to withdraw my amendments. They are deemed put forward by the committee. That is a motion, a committee motion that you yourselves adopted, unfortunately, and every committee has done so right through the system of the Parliament of Canada. And it does mean that I must proceed to present each and every one of these unless we can find a solution. I wanted to open with an offering that we know that a number of my amendments will be deemed to be inadmissible. And I would like to ask the committee that from my point of view, there's no purpose in me speaking to inadmissible motions, so I don't intend to. I want to make that clear right now. We can skip over anything inadmissible.
The Green have brought in 45 amendments to this bill. So I just find it passing strange that someone would make commentary on the pace at which we're going when they brought in 45 amendments. I am interested to hear on some of these Green amendments. I find it absolutely shocking to even see in print The idea that even, the Liberals clearly and the NDP have said, you know what, they don't like mandatory minimums for all offenses. But now, I'd love to hear an explanation as to why sexual exploitation, incest, bestiality, making child pornography, parent or guardian procuring sexual activity, making sexually explicit material available to a child, luring a child. These are all the absolutely disgusting offenses that the Green Party is saying we should have no mandatory minimum for. I mean, it's outrageous to dump all these amendments and then to basically gut the criminal code. And I don't know how many of you have committee members have taken the opportunity to look at all of the Green amendments. And I don't blame you if you haven't seen them all, because there's 44 of them. But trafficking a person under 18, obtaining sexual services for consideration from a person under 18, procuring a person under 18. Is there a common theme? Almost all of them deal with children, in Canadian children being victimized in the most awful way, and the Green Party wants to remove the mandatory minimums. So I think that these amendments are frankly disgusting. I really do. I think Canadians would be appalled. I was appalled when I saw them in print. It made me want to gag to see the type of offenses that they're saying, nope, we don't want to send any. If the judge wants to say, walk out of here free, you can walk out free. I think it's appalling. That is my commentary on the Green Party amendments as a whole. On this one specifically, you know what? There's a reason why there's a mandatory minimum penalty for weapons trafficking with a firearm. There's weapons trafficking that can be other illegal weapons like switchblades, other knives. This is weapons trafficking in a firearm. It's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with, we're vesting with, and it's irresponsible to basically dump the gutting of the entire criminal code on our committee. But those are my comments on that for now.
Point of order. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, but I object to being mischaracterized as gutting the criminal code. Those offenses
Just when it
are
applies to
offenses that would
children.
remain in the criminal code. We're objecting to the use of inefficient, expensive, and counterproductive measures, which are called mandatory minimums. All of the offenses that my colleague finds appalling and make me sick too. They are disgusting offenses, and anyone found guilty should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
not what
But
your
I
amendment
prefer
says.
to leave it to a judge in the discretion of the judiciary, looking at individual circumstances and not blanket approaches which have been proven not to work. So I object to being put on the record and in any way, shape, or form as calling for gutting the criminal code. Those are offenses that will remain in the criminal code, and let's hope that they are fully prosecuted and that the punishment fits the crime. And when you use a blanket cookie cutter, you just say mandatory minimum, you do not have a punishment fitting the crime. You reduce the discretion and the ability of the prosecuting attorney to get the right sentence. And you end up having some people going to jail who weren't guilty because they're so fearful of a mandatory minimum, they'll plead out even though they have not committed the crime. So I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I wanted to also put on the record that due to previous commitments and not realizing this committee would run late, my colleague, the Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre, Mike Morris, is going to take over, so I withdraw at this point, but I wanted it recognized by the committee before I left that this is acceptable, that Member for Kitchener Centre replaces me in the committee.
Green Party Amendment number 1, based on the principle of judicial discretion, that mandatory minimum penalties don't actually deter crime and that they disproportionately affect marginalized populations. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Moore?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And on this Green Amendment, I know you've ruled the others out of order, so I'm not going to speak to them, but it would have been interesting to hear Green members defend removing the mandatory penalties that Canadians have seen fit to put in place for making child pornography,
Yes.
making explicit material,
The
luring a
member
child.
just had a point of order.
Point of order. I believe we're speaking to Green Party Amendment 17. Can the member speak to Green Party Amendment 17?
Mr. Moria, I would ask that you stick to.
I agree 100%. If I was Mr. Morrison, I wouldn't want to speak to all those things either. But, they dumped it into our committee, eliminating mandatory penalties for serious offenses against children. And now they get here and they don't want to speak to it. So it's a little confusing. If you're gonna put forward an amendment that deals with these type of sexual offenses against children, I think you should be prepared to speak to it and defend them.